Nick. There we are. There we are. Thank you so much to Norma Wong for that incredible opening and invocation, the invitation to rediscover our traditions of solidarity and to reconnect with the wisdom of our homelands in thinking about how we move forward. I particularly appreciated Norma's reminder to us that we are in a period of collapse, that we are in a time of collapse. And there is a famous quote that I think about a lot these days, especially from Antonio Gramsci, where he said, the old order is dying, the old world is dying, the new one struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters. The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters. But as a proud Ethiopian American who comes from a country with a 1,000-year tradition of epic poetry and a proud science fiction and fantasy nerd who started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was 12 years old, I know that the time of monsters is also the time of heroes. The time of heroes and heroines and sheroes and theyros. It is an honor and a privilege to be in a room full of heroes and sheroes and theyros and speaking with a panel of heroes about where we've come from and where we're going. So we look forward to this conversation. I'm pleased to be in conversation with Christine Chen, Executive Director of APIAVote. You can applaud, it's okay. Andrea Flores, Vice President of Immigration Policy for Forward.us. Kica Matos, President of NIIC, the National Immigration Law Center. Rima Meroueh, Executive Director of National Network for Arab American Communities, NAC. And Angelica Salas, Executive Director of the Coalition for Humane Immigration, for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, or CHIRLA. So as we enter into the conversation, let's start by looking back before we look forward. How do things look in this moment? What can we learn about the state of democracy, our movements, and our communities, the communities that we are on stage and in this room, working on behalf of, representing, working with. And I want to start the conversation by thinking about the way that various ideas and issues and crises were weaponized in this election. And I want to start with the border, the US-Mexico border, or rather a border, but the one that was most salient in this election. How was the border weaponized in the election, and why were we vulnerable to having that happen? And I want to start and invite you, Andrea, to open us on that point.
Well, first of all, thank you all. It's an honor to be here with so many people who are working outside of DC to serve immigrant communities, so it's a real honor. And a little bit more about me. I grew up originally in a border community, and I entered sort of government and politics with the hope of sort of bringing Washington's perspective about our border communities, border states, closer to the reality of what I had grown up in, what my Mexican-American family had experienced, and those from the El Paso, Las Cruces, Ciudad Juarez area know that it's an incredible region, incredible history. And I have been in DC now for most of my career, and in this election, the border ended up emerging as a real threshold issue, but where that was really concerning to me as someone who had been in this work was how predictable that was, right? In President Trump's first term, he really some of the worst horrors of administration were visible at the US-Mexico border. And so that really rallied communities around what were some of the, the easiest ways that our immigration system does harm to immigrants, to asylum seekers, to families. And at the end of those 4 years, when I joined the Biden transition team, there was an idea of reversal, right? Reversing every kind of policy he had done. But what there wasn't really a discussion of, there was a beginning of a discussion was what we wanted to build forward and what we wanted to create at the border and what kind of processes and how should human beings be treated and how could we modernize some of our protection systems and how could we acknowledge the fact that there had not been a new sort of legal pathway for displaced people created since 1990, right? We weren't having those conversations. And from the start when I joined the Biden administration, it was clear that we were living in sort of Donald Trump's vision of the border still. And we were living and using his tools and saw those as like the full menu of options. And so my takeaway from that was that those tools had failed, and they failed honestly for the last 10 to 20 years, right? This idea of hoping that a displaced person will be deterred by what may or may not happen to their asylum eligibility by the time they reach the US-Mexico border is an archaic thought. This idea that we should be completely reliant on other countries being able to carry out human rights abuses because the US doesn't want to, but if we pay other countries to do so, they'll do it and kind of push our border south. This has been a cycle since Obama that has been tried and failed. And so one thing that we're trying to do, I know we're looking backward, is the border was able to be weaponized because we haven't been building a system that serves the human beings at the border better, and that we also haven't been acknowledging as a country that we have to have a broader conversation about new arrivals, how people are coming, why they're coming. They're coming for 3 reasons: people who are displaced, seeking protection, people trying to reunite with family. We make it incredibly hard for them to do so. If you're a Mexican citizen, if you're a Mexican national, you could wait 200 years to be reunited with your family through our current legal immigration process. And also people coming for employment. We have Indians coming to our border right now because the wait time for an employment visa is over 150 years. Our entire system is creating sort of this flow at the border that then was weaponized, and the Biden administration didn't have a response, right? It just did it. It went back to the old tools. It went back to remain in Mexico. It kept Title 42. It's now, essentially, asylum has been reduced to a lottery system. That isn't a way forward for any country, any democracy, to sort of leave that issue hanging and not provide like a vision. So when I talk about going forward, my organization is going to be launching sort of a new vision of someone from a border community, what I hope the border will look like one day, but all of us in this room are going to have to build it because it impacts every single other piece of the immigration politics right now, especially if you work with the Democrats and the Republicans. All they want to do is talk about the border, and so we're going to have to unlock a sort of a different way forward, and so look out for a new border vision coming.
That's right. There was a famous quote in the civil rights movement that the Mason-Dixon line separating the North from the South starts at the US-Canada border. And so we really saw in this election that we are all border states in a very real way. So Angelica, you and I are old school organizers in many ways, and in grassroots organizing, when everything else fails, what you do is you go back to the base and you listen to the wisdom of the base, and you reground yourself in the communities where we organize. What have you heard? What are you hearing? What's the conversation right now with the communities that CHIRLA organizes and serves?
Well, thank you so much. And it's true, as organizers, and the idea is always you'll never get lost if you get closer to your people. And so I think it's really important that we always remember that. But before I answer your question, it's important for me to recognize my colleagues who are part of CHIRLA, who are out here, who actually every day do the work that I get to talk about, and that I have just the ability to work with brilliant, committed human beings. And then I also want to shout out all my California folks who are in the room, so shout out to California. So the first thing I wanted to maybe just share is a little bit about who we are as an organization. We're an immigrant rights mass membership organization that is led by immigrants. Myself, I'm an immigrant from Mexico, but almost everybody that works at CHIRLA is an immigrant or a child of immigrants. Many of us have lived experiences of both detention, deportation, and just living in this country as the immigrants we are. And so it really shapes the way we do our work day in and day out. So our purpose, first and foremost, is to organize our community. Organized, we then advocate with them. We don't advocate for them, we advocate with them. And then we also provide the services, our member services, our legal services, that's about fighting for renewal of DACA, citizenship, it's about family unity. And so through our work, we see day in and day out how policies have a real impact in people's lives. So when you ask me, well, what are folks thinking? The first thing we do at CHIRLA is actually go to our communities. So we have our committees from all over the state of California. We have 13 different offices across the state. Most of them all built first from committees of organized individuals. And so just recently, first we started with our committee of our adult leaders, and we organize intergenerationally, bringing all our state leaders together about this moment, but also we're just at UC Merced with all our undocumented youth, both from high school and also in the community, and all the community colleges and Cal States, and asking about this moment. And I think the one thing that when I saw this question, I thought, well, what is it that I really want to convey to everybody through this question? And I think the first thing is that this country creates a caricature of who we are as immigrants. And on one side, it's this very villainous, criminal individual or group of individuals to be feared. But on the other side, we actually also have another caricature, which is about a hopeless, vulnerable individual always living in fear. And I think those two sides of that caricature are so far from our reality. And who we are just regular people who have made a decision that they're going to fight with everything so that they can have what everybody else wants, which is peace, tranquility, a life without fear, but a life also in unity with their family and their community. And from that, where our community is that they're going to fight. They're not going to just be spectators in a world and in a country that seeks to destroy everything that they have done and everything they have built in this country, or that seeks to not recognize everything that they have sacrificed to be in this country. And so when I think about this, I also think about, yeah, our folks are nervous, and they're rightfully so, because what is being put forward is cruel and it's senseless. And so the one thing that I just really want to say is that we have our members right now who are saying, we're going to fight. And many of those members are individuals who are fighting their deportation in Trump 1.0, who fought, who won. And now they're telling all their folk, the rest of their members and the other committees, members of CHIRLA, and they're saying, fight. We're going to fight. We're going to stand together. We're going to fight for our families. We're going to prepare to stay. We're going to prepare to stay with our families and in the communities we love.
Thank you, Angelica. Such an important reminder that our fight did not begin on Election Day, and it did not end on Election Day. It's been going on since the beginnings of this country. But certainly elections are a test of what we've built. What can we learn and reflect on from this election about what we've built, what we haven't built? Christine, want to invite you to pick up there, particularly from the perspective of your work with APIA communities.
Yeah, since elections, right now everyone's going to this blame game and trying to analyze every single aspect of the electorate. But I would say that we need to even look back, not 4 years, but maybe even 8 years, looking back at that our communities have been under attack, and we've just been running. And it's many times, unfortunately, we've had to be reactive, right? But we haven't necessarily been able to take the time to really breathe, to really figure out during this time period, how has this worn down our infrastructure? Looking back now, especially what just happened, is that our communications infrastructure really needs to be reevaluated. Our communities have grown, we've become more diverse, but have we actually kept up with that in terms of really, and I'm not even just talking about technology-wise, I'm really talking about how do we communicate with one another? Do we have the right people in all these different growing communities in the providing that actually have the language capabilities, and on top of that, it's layered now with the complications of the growing mis and disinformation that's really not going to go away, right? And on top of that communication infrastructure, have we also started to take a look? We need to take a look in terms of even our organizing, going back to the basics. What does our base look like? How can we expand our base? I think even though after the elections I've actually continued to travel, the number one question people keep asking is like, what can I do? What can we do? And these are people that I think are not necessarily always have been involved with our social service agencies. Maybe they've never even, but they have huge concerns about what they're seeing and hearing. So it is about how do we bring people maybe that they don't necessarily in the beginning have the same vision as we do, but maybe they're more moderate, or maybe they're in these different spaces. Like, how do we break down those silos? Because that is what we actually need to rebuild from a communication standpoint, as well as from an organizational infrastructure, and really provide opportunities for different people that can enter into our movement. With different skill sets and maybe different knowledge about our communities and the narrative. So I think for me, it's not necessarily about analyzing X, Y, Z. It's really going back to the fundamentals of evaluating not only the movement, but each of our own organizations. What are we as a community doing in terms of our rebuilding?
Thank you, Christine. An important reminder that we need to go back to our roots, that radical means at the root, and so we need to have a radical vision of the way forward, and a reminder that the world has changed, have our movements, have our organizations, and our opponents, the people who would suppress and oppress and divide us, have made it very easy and very welcoming to join their movement, and are we doing the same? So thank you. I'm going to turn to you next, Rima. I'm going to just keep throwing quotes at you. But another one that I think about a lot these days is anyone who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. We have been treated to a parade of both absurdities and atrocities for some time, whether that's the anti-democratic trends and slide to open authoritarianism in our politics, the mass death that we experienced under COVID and really have locked away in memory, and of course the horrific atrocities that have been committed in Gaza and the spectacle, the heart-rending spectacle of loss of life there. What does this election, a similar question, what does this election show about who we are, who our communities are, who our polity is, what we've done and what we have not done and what we need yet to do?
So it's a really difficult question. I thought a lot about this because I think at some point what this election has made me realize is that we haven't really looked to what is missing. We talk about what is missing, and for me, the thing that I saw as missing is that we don't have a movement. We have a lot of issues that we work on as communities. Each of us goes back to our spaces, and we work in our cities, we work in our states, some of us work on the national level, but we don't have a broader movement that is rooted in values about what our communities need. And so if you think about what you are trying to create, perhaps you have a vision of what you are, the society that you want. Your community may have a vision for what they want their lives to look like. But the question then becomes, are we basing our work, are we rooting our work in those values? And what I saw in this election is really that a lot of us worked on issues. And when we talk about justice, if we were rooted in values, when we talk about justice, we would be seeking justice for all. When we talk about healthcare, are we talking about healthcare for all? When we talk about immigration policies, are we considering how policies, immigration policies, may impact people from all over the world, whether it's climate migration, whether it's conflict, whether it's fleeing from whatever it may be? Are we actually thinking about how all immigrants all people of the world may be impacted by those policies? And to give specific examples, when protesters were protesting and saying Black Lives Matter, they talked about a policing system that was not harming our communities. Many people stayed away from this issue because they felt like, number one, they may lose funding if they talk about this, or they may, it's not their lane. And yet, we are all impacted by militarization and colonization, and they're all rooted in the same system, but yet it became an issue as opposed to a value that we were working towards. When we talk about policing in this country, we don't talk about militarization. We don't talk about the fact that there is a live stream genocide happening, and it is with our tax dollars that we need, right? And for those of you who are not doing anything on that, my question would be, how are we rooted in humanity and in justice if you are not saying something about that? Because the fear is you may lose funding, right? It goes back to that. However, if on all of these issues, all of us work together, we're not all gonna lose funding, right? There is a community, and to go back to what Norma was talking about, we do not think like a community. We are not a movement. We are pieces of a movement. And what is missing is to bring those pieces together into a movement and into a community. Because right now we're not a community together. We are individual communities in this room. And what does it take? And I will challenge you to think about this. What does it take to become a community? What is missing from all of us, the work that we are doing? What is missing from becoming a community? And I was asked recently, do Arab Americans actually think that Trump is going to be better? And actually, I've been asked this question many times, not just once. Number one, I would say let's stay away from blaming immigrants, because let's remember that we are not the one who put him in office. So that's number one. And number two, the question that really needs to be asked there is, are we working for elected officials, or are they working for us? Whoever said they're not going to vote for Biden because they want this war to stop are working the system exactly as it's meant to be. You are holding your elected officials accountable. So if we were rooted in values, if our work was rooted in values, then all of these things would matter, and we would all be working towards the same. And I will say really quickly, because I'm out of time, it's flashing into my face, I don't want this to be just an idea that we talk about. There are ways to really do that. When you are strategizing and planning, plan first for what is the vision of a society, the society that you want to see, and then find your part in that. And don't just stop there. Find everybody else's part, and let's create a vision, a broader vision, even if it means connecting with 3 or 4 other nonprofits that are doing work. If you are immigration, work with someone who's doing healthcare, work with someone who's doing economic development, so that when you are talking about immigrant families, you're not only talking about the policies that bring them here, but you're thinking about how they can live a life with dignity when they're here.
Thank you, Rima, for that reminder that if we want to live into our values, it means being consistent. It means not just fighting for ourselves or for our narrow, the narrow interests of a sub-community or a small part, but really fighting for our shared interests and values. I want to, on that note, pivot to Kica. NIIC has been such a thought leader in helping us think through how we are tackling the big systems, the legal, political systems that shape the possibilities of what we are fighting for, and many times limit the possibilities of what we're fighting for, and how we move beyond them. How do we hold on to that vision, the big vision of where we want to get to, in a time when it feels like we are sliding backwards, that we are re-fighting many of the fights that we had hoped we would move forward from, and when we're entering a period where the authoritarian trend seems more open?
We fight because we have to. We fight because we have no choice. We fight because we believe in the liberation of multiple disenfranchised communities, and we have a vision of justice in this country, right? Isn't that why we're here? Yes? Having said that, I want to be real, because those of you who work with me know I always try to keep it real, and as I would say in Spanish, yo no tengo pelo en la lengua. We are facing, and that means, the literal translation means I don't have any hair in my tongue, which means I like to tell it like it is. But having said that, look, we are facing one of the most dangerous times in our nation's history. We should be concerned, and we should be prepared. Trump's plans for immigrants are as horrifying as they are comprehensive. And what's particularly concerning is his willingness to weaponize government to go after immigrants. But this is something that we need to remind people, which is that he will begin with immigrants, but he will not end with immigrants. His path towards authoritarianism will be created on the backs of immigrants. Let me repeat that. Trump's path to authoritarianism is going to be created on the backs of immigrants. That is why every single person in this room has to be prepared to fight with everything we have. Let me make just three quick, or at least share three quick reflections about what we should expect in the coming months and the next 4 years. The first is we should expect that not every single strategy that we deployed under Trump 1.0 is going to work. Project 2025 has been all about figuring out how to move this agenda that's anti-immigrant, that is deeply racist, that is deeply misogynistic, with very few barriers, right? So all of us who engage in advocacy need to be ready, we need to anticipate, we need to be ready to pivot, and we have to be fearless. The second reflection I want to share is that we have to be discerning and strategic about what fights we engage. And we have to also accept that there will be some losses, right? We're not going to win it all, but we can be strategic. And we also have to be mindful of those smoke bombs, right? Remember what Trump did so well the last time? He would talk shit about something, make some threats, say something bombastic, and we would all be outraged, and we would all be responding to that smoke bomb. And in the meantime, what he was doing was advancing a very insidious agenda elsewhere. So we have to be really clear-eyed about what's coming, and we have to figure out how to be strategic. And then the last thing I would say is, look, we cannot do it alone. This movement cannot do it alone. We have to reach out to our allies. No one organization, not this movement alone, is going to be able to defend what is coming at us. And so we have to engage in the strategy of, Angelica just said, organizing, right? But we must organize outside of our communities. For NIIC, I mean, what I'll say is we've been doing preparedness planning for a year. We are ready. We are ready to defend our Constitution. We are ready to fight for our democracy. And we are never, ever going to lose sight, right, of that vision that we all collectively share, because that is one of the things that authoritarians are really good at, wanting to convince you. that you have to give up and you have to be compliant, and hell no, that is not who we are, and that is not how we roll.
Absolutely, and thank you for that reminder that authoritarianism really relies on our anticipatory compliance, right? Our giving up and acquiescing in advance in the hopes that, as Audre Lorde said, our silence will protect us, but our silence will not protect us, is what Audre Lorde said. So, grounding ourselves in what we've just seen and where we are now, I want to talk about looking forward and invite the panelists to share some reflections on looking forward, on the courageous conversations that we have to have in this period, and particularly with an eye towards the way that the politics of scarcity and threat played out. The idea that we're voting or not voting in many cases based on what the threats are rather than our aspirations or our visions, and how we get beyond that. So I think I'll just start at the end with you, Andrea, and then work our way down.
Sure. So where we are now, I want to be honest, I think we have a big political problem, right? So when we talk about compliance already with Trump's agenda, that's happening already in both parties. There was an interview with Trump yesterday, talked about deporting US citizen children. I'm waiting for the outrage from DC. I'm waiting for the outrage from our progressive partners, stakeholders. I'm not hearing it yet. There is sort of already compliance from the administration not wanting to use some of their last legal tools to protect the few immigrants that they still can protect, right? The people that they asked to come into the US from Nicaragua to apply for parole, to come here with a sponsor, they let that parole lapse as people are going to become undocumented and be targets for mass deportation back to a country that will almost certainly persecute them upon their removals. These are things that are happening every single day right now in this lame duck period, and I'm not seeing either party pushing back. And I say either party because both parties have an obligation to, and Democrats have an even bigger obligation to. But I'm worried that they're taking the read from this last election as that even defending immigrants is a political liability. That's where we're going into the second Trump administration. It's very palpable from my perspective in DC. We have the first Latino elected senator in Arizona. I don't know if he's actually the first, but the newly elected, saying on a radio interview that mass deportations in some cases are okay. That's where we're starting, Trump 2.0. And I want to just name all of that because I'm very alarmed about what that means. And I'm also very alarmed that the position from DC will be to pick and choose which groups are most sympathetic to go forward and defend, right? We saw yesterday in Trump's interview saying he wants to do a DACA deal. At the same time, he's saying, let's deport entire families and US citizen children. So that normalization of something very extreme, and then that normalization of something that Democrats have made the very sort of almost like a baseline issue is what we're going to have to organize around. So I'm being very urgent because I feel that what's going to happen is it has to go back to the states, and what I mean by that is we have to bring the American electorate back to this side and not only show them, because I really do not believe that this election was about Americans choosing something like mass deportations as a policy. I believe that they were not seeing solutions really about this broken system that was unfolding, whether it was in New York, Denver, Boston. It was unfolding because of an authoritarian Republican governor who was sending buses of people and a government not stopping him from doing so for years, right? These are things that we've already sort of witnessed and seen happen that have changed our politics fundamentally. So I think when going forward, really making sure we are not playing into the trope of who's more deserving than others in terms of protection and defense. And I think the best place that happens is in the states, because I guarantee you, when I think about New Mexico, I don't think anyone is worried about what someone has TPS or DACA or is on parole or is a long time undocumented. They're just gonna be upset because schools are having raids and work sites are having raids, right? Like, we as a community cannot play into some statuses are more defensible than others anymore. And I think that has been a political trend in the last 12 years in this movement. Certainly, I've mostly sat in government, and I have been on the other side and been advocated to and been told, when some statuses are somehow more deserving than others. And I just don't believe that, going back to what system are we trying to build. And at the end of the day, the US is the largest undocumented population in the entire world. And it's that way because we as a nation have benefited from that, but also because our politics has not actually tried to upend or change that fundamentally. The last time there was a push for a comprehensive bill was in 2013. This Democratic president, who ran on many pro-immigration promises, dropped even the longtime undocumented from his major congressional negotiation. He sent his team to the Hill every single day, and they told us repeatedly they wouldn't even fight for Dreamers anymore in that negotiation. So I just want to level set that I hope that we can all work together, and that those in the states and those in the cities, you have so much power to show that your communities actually don't believe in dividing us all, dividing, everyone up and saying we're only going to stand with one group of people over the other. You can really show that my community is pissed that mass deportations is happening. My industry is losing. Employers should really be so angry that we have a system where they can hire someone with work authorization one day and then Trump can strip it away the next day. What kind of system is that? What kind of economy is that, right? I mean, aside from the exploitation, and we're going to have to organize really differently, because I don't see it coming from DC. It's going to come from all of you, and I just hope at the national level we can meet you with continuing to build up that affirmative framework, so that way when Trump comes to the Hill and he tries to end asylum and end TPS as a program as we know it, and likely ask for several other concessions, that we don't just settle and say, well, at least only DACA recipients, not even all Dreamers, get citizenship, right? Like, we really have to be ready for that moment and that negotiation, and not accept the cruelty as the new political baseline for us to win elections. So that's where I'm really at, and I hope that I'm looking forward to working with all of you.
Very important. Thank you, Andrea. Kica?
Yeah, I'll go next. I really want to speak about the ways that Trump was so masterful at dividing us, because that's something that I think we need to figure out how to get past. And I'll start, it's almost like concentric circles, that I'm going to start inwardly with our communities and some of the new kinds of tensions that I found really troubling, right? The tensions between new arrivals and longtime immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, right? Hadn't seen that before, right? That should worry us all. People feeling like these new folks are getting things that we are still 10, 15, 20 years later fighting for. The tensions between Black folks and immigrants, Black folks and new arrivals. My colleague Lawrence Benito from ICER, I know he's here somewhere. He's been ringing the alarm bells for some time, right? Because in a struggle over limited resources in far too many cities and communities, what we ended up seeing was Black people, people of color, pitting themselves off and fighting against each other, right? That's something else that we need to really worry about. You take it outside of that, right? For every problem that was raised during the elections, guess who was to blame? It was immigrants. Immigrants were to blame for lack of jobs, for lack of housing, anything negative that came up in the course of the elections, right? It was constantly, every single answer to every single question, who's to blame? It's immigrants, right? And so those of us who have historically been Democrats and fought on the Democratic side and relied on our Democratic champions, right? It was really disturbing to all of a sudden look over to the Democratic Party and say, hey, you got our backs? No. What did they do? They swung to the right, and they talked about security, and they talked about the border, right? So it was almost like this brilliant way of divide and conquer that was really troubling for us as a movement, also for our democracy, right? And also for the visions that we have of this country. The last thing I will say, and this is a critique of this movement, and I think it's something that we need to think about, we have to go back to the base, right? I want to lift up again what my sister Angelica said. For far too long, right, for at least the last decade, there have been less resources that have been pumped into the organizing that needs to happen. So is it any wonder that too many young people of color, right, and Latino men, right, voted for Trump? I won't have all of the answers as to why, but I can tell you without any doubt that part of the reason why is because we have not paid enough attention to organizing, knocking on doors, talking to folks, bringing people in, right? That kind of organizing is something that this movement has walked away from, and we need to resource it, and we need to go back to the basics.
Thank you, Kica. Angelica?
So I think the way I want to start this in terms of the scarcity is let's be real. Poverty in this country is visible. Doesn't matter if you're in LA, New York, San Francisco. In many of our metropolitan cities, you can walk outside and you will see somebody who is unhoused. It's real. We have people who are struggling, and they are trying to put food on their table. They're trying to pay the rent, keep the mortgage, pay the mortgage, be able to keep their families whole, and they're just surviving. And many of our members are in that same place. Many of them who cannot stay in the apartments that they've been in for some 20 years. So I think the first thing that as an immigrant rights movement, because I do believe that we're a movement working together, is that we need to really confront the economic inequality in this country. And it is real, and it is visible, and it actually undermines everything we need to do if we ourselves as immigrant rights organizations don't understand that the fight for worker justice and economic justice is our fight. And I think that's really important as we move forward. The other piece too is that during this election, there was a very concerted effort to divide the very people who are in most pain. Because what they did was they basically started talking about who was to blame. And the thing is that this isn't new. This is a tired, old story in this country, which is when we have economic challenges, when we have major community challenges, instead of having courageous, visionary electeds and representatives of our communities, instead we have people who are incompetent, and I'm going to say that, incompetent in their ability to govern, and then start blaming the very people that they're supposed to be helping. So that is why in 2024, we had the same tropes, the same conversation that we were having in 1954. And what happened in 1954? That's when we had Operation Wetback in this country, where Mexicans were deported en masse with their U.S. citizen children. That happened in this country. And in 1 year, in one solid year, over 1 million people were deported. And there were planes, and there were trains, and there was massive agent, increase in agents at that time, INS, or the Immigration Naturalization Service. And the thing is that right now, our budget to do everything that they want to do has been given to some of these individuals with, it's basically in a golden platter, in a silver platter. I think that's how you say it, in a silver platter. I mean, this is about billions and billions of dollars that are going to be generated towards our pain. And so we have to stand up against this. We have to stand up against the inequality, the pain that our communities are suffering, and we have to stand up against this cruelty. And the first thing that we have to do in order to move forward is we truly have to have the discipline of unity. And I really want to uplift what you said, Andrea. This is not the time for us to start picking and choosing who's going to be saved. This is a time for each one of us to understand if we are in these organizations that we represent, we better ask ourselves, am I willing to embrace the duty that I have right now? Am I willing to stand up for the people who are going to be attacked? Am I willing to create a movement that actually doesn't have winners and losers or statuses and these folks get this and those folks get that, but instead that we collectively unify and we confront the challenges in this country? And I truly, truly believe in folks in this room, and I truly believe in our members, that we can be the individuals who then move our country forward in a united way that can actually bring real remedy and real change to each and every one of us.
Thank you. Thank you for that vision.
So building upon what was already said, you know, the whole idea of scarcity, I think it goes back to that the other side's been in it for the long game, and the communications and the narrative has been out there, and what we need to provide is not only just the unity, but what is that counter narrative or vision that we have for this society, for immigrants, and how is that really integrated, not only about economics, and I think it's always been framed, you know, from that vantage point, but really the contributions and the livelihoods of immigrants is integrated in so much of our everyday, of so many different aspects, of so many crossing different issues, right? And so how can we go ahead and provide a counter narrative that is inclusive, that provides a vision in terms of this other alternative that we want to present to folks and for them to embrace? Because I just go back to even back in 2022 when in the Asian American community, we were surprised that Stephen Miller was sending us postcards, you know, right before the elections, and it wasn't even about voting for a particular candidate, but they were laying out a narrative about whites and Asians versus Latinos and blacks, right? And since then, I've actually continued to see so much advertising, even for myself, who I would consider I don't necessarily watch or view different content that would give the demographics where I would actually be served those kind of advertising from the other side, but I've actually been seeing that more and more. After the elections, I've actually also have seen 2 or 3 different newsletters that are disguised as lifestyle newsletters that when I actually look at it, first of all, I'm like, why, how did I even get this? And then 2, the narratives that they're feeding is so anti-immigrant, as well as so many other things that really support the Project 2025 narrative. So what I fear is that there are things that we need to immediately deal with, but at the same time, we need to really strategically really figure out, not only just within the immigrant coalition, but with as you were saying, if we really are going to have a true movement, it really is about what that narrative is. Do we have deep penetration and to get out to those, so it's not necessarily just within those who are immediately impacted or those who are immediately involved, but really win the hearts and minds of others, so that way they actually will believe that the new vision that we're actually providing.
Thank you.
Amaha, I have a quote test for you.
Okay.
If they come for you tonight, they will come for me in the morning.
James Baldwin to Angela Davis.
James Baldwin to Angela
Thank you.
Davis. I think
This is why we're friends, Rima.
I think that summarizes why everything you all have said, that we cannot do this on our own. And I think the reason that one in particular is so important for me, I do feel like often in our movement, I'll call it a movement even though I said it's not a movement, I do feel like we tend to show up as saviors and not as I may be impacted by this as well. And I think if we are able to start thinking about these policies as harmful to not only the community that it's targeting at that moment, that potentially it's going to come back to harm my community, I think we remove that savior mentality and we start to work together truly on the ground and organize together. And an example of this is after 9/11, the Patriot Act was meant to surveil Arab and Muslim communities. It was then used to surveil Black Lives Matter movements. A lot of these policies may be targeting one community, but eventually are going to be used against every single one of our communities. And so, for one, we are constantly responding to, I would say, to kind of answer the question, when we think about how we move forward and not allow this division that was happening pre-election and that continues to happen now with blame, it's to think about who is going to be responding and who is going to be keeping their eye on the long-term vision, on the long-term work, and creating an immigration system, a healthcare system, an education system that doesn't leave any of our communities or children behind, right? And if we have that plan, then there's no way to, number one, show up as saviors, because we all are invested in this, in fixing that system. But number two, we are both looking at responding and at the long-term work. And I think right now with Trump coming, this is especially important because there are already a lot of organizations going into response mode, which is great. We're going to have to respond to a lot of what is going to come at us. But the question then is, who is keeping their eye on the long-term vision for what we want our families, how we want our families to live, how we want to live a life with dignity, how we no longer become the target and we start to be the ones to create these changes and create a vision for our own futures and not have others create those for us. So I think the only thing I want to say is I know a lot of you are with nonprofits here, and there might be funders as well as nonprofit leaders. I think one of the things that I've seen is because we are so fragmented, each of us take on issues, right? The way that nonprofit is funded is, what is your issue? Let me fund your issue. And it's not necessarily, let's fund a big vision. What happens with that is, I'm kind of sitting here on my own, working towards data equity by trying to get MENA, the Middle East or North African community data so that we can actually understand disparities. And I'm doing that on my own. And then someone else is doing something else, and every single one of you is focusing on one thing or another. And then what happens with that is, because you're so small, you likely will not be able to get it done in one funding cycle. So what happens after that? You lose the funding and it moves on to someone else. There is no continuity for our work. And so the only way to come out of that is, even we as nonprofits, people who are working in nonprofits, is to create a system where we are all working in parts, but we're doing that together and in some way finding a solution towards the future. And that has to be, again, and I will keep going back to this, it has to be rooted in what are the values that we are working towards.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rima. And I think we've heard a common theme amongst all the panelists, the invitation to solidarity, the recognition that we're not going to get through this by deciding who we can shove off the boat, who we can throw under the bus, who we can climb over to try to escape the threat that's coming. We need to, and the reminder that we need not to turn on each other, but to turn towards each other. So that is those are powerful words as we chart the path ahead. This next part on my agenda just says, Amaha, moderator privilege as you wish, which is just a very dangerous thing to put in writing to me. But I'm going to take the privilege just on pick up on the theme of courageous conversations to brag not about myself, but about our grassroots members at African Communities Together. Shortly before the election, we did our first ever national membership convention, brought together our members from New York, the DMV area, and Pennsylvania, and then our our partners from across the country. We had hundreds of grassroots African immigrant leaders in an auditorium in Harlem. Delivery workers, home health care workers, hair braiders, as well as professionals and students, and we adopted a set of social change principles, our theory of change as an organization, and a set of community principles about how we want to be in community with each other. among those were we're taking this invitation to solidarity. We reject tribalism. We reject anti-blackness, whether it's towards black immigrants like ourselves or towards our sisters and brothers in the diaspora, multi-generational African Americans, the descendants of enslaved Africans. We reject sexism and we embrace equality on the grounds of gender and sexual orientation. And it was not an easy conversation, it was a courageous conversation, but our members rose to the occasion brilliantly. So I think it's important to remind ourselves that when we have these conversations, when we offer people real choices, and when we offer people a better community and identity to be part of, many will take us up on that invitation. So as we close out, we promised that we would end with kind of the looking forward view. So I want to look beyond the next 2 years, the next time that we have a federal election, beyond the next 4 years, and look towards our North Stars, our vision of the future. How are we and how are each of your organizations, institutions, movements that you lead going to move us towards that vision of the future over the next 4 years and beyond? And we can start here and move back in this direction, or do you want to take a crack? Or we can, or actually, yeah, that's better. Why don't we popcorn? Whoever feels moved to speak, like a Quaker meeting, you can go first.
I'll start in the middle.
Okay, thanks.
That way, so we'll start in the middle. So for CHIRLA, we're going to be 40 years in 2026, and we were founded in 1986 with Immigration Reform and Control Act amnesty. That's when many of my family was actually able to be legalized. And this is after, as a child, I actually had experienced the deportation of my mom in a worksite rate at a garment factory. But the thing that I will always remember is when people were able to legalize their status, and my uncles and aunts and the whole family, and just the celebration and sort of this idea of newfound freedom. So for CHIRLA, our mission is to create a just society fully inclusive of immigrants. And so when we talk about a just society, what our vision is about, economic justice, it is about access to health care, it is about access to quality education, it is about full civil liberties, etc. That's what we are. But we want to be included in all that, right? That's what we say, and that's what we fight for. And so from our perspective, as an organization, we're first respondents. So we're the ones that people call when there is a worksite raid, when there is a community raid, when people are detained, our members call us, and we respond. But even though we're responding, we have a vision towards the future. And so what we fight for is a moment in which we have the freedom to stay in our home countries because we actually can have what we deserve. But we also have the freedom to move and to migrate if that is not so. The quest for life is human. And so for us, it's also about then how are our policies that we're pursuing at the local, state, and national level first give an opportunity for leaders to arise and emerge, our grassroots leaders, but also new elected champions who actually will stand with our values. And so that's why we pursue the registry. We have the registry campaign. We will forever support the path to citizenship and the fight for the transformation of our immigration system, because it does not work. But we truly believe that mass legalization with permanent residency is what we deserve. And I don't care how many people think we're crazy, because that is what our people are asking us for. So we have the registry campaign. which is the statute of limitations embedded in immigration law that says that if you've been here for a long time, it doesn't matter if you're DACA, TPS, or humanitarian parole, or et cetera, but that you can actually legalize your status. That's why we are part of the the Value Our Families campaign, and we fight for the Reuniting Families Act so that we have family unity for everybody. That's why we support the Climate Displaced Persons Act, so we can recognize climate change as a driver for migration, and that's why we're part of the Fairness for Freedom campaign, because we believe in universal representation, and nobody should have to confront all of these, all of this persecution without somebody who's accompanying them and supporting their rights. So that's what we fight for, and I believe that that's what we need to see in the future. What we fight for is what we deserve, not what people tell us that we should settle for.
Thank you, Angelica. We fight for what we deserve.
I'll go next.
Kica?
At NIIC, our mission is to advance the rights and the opportunities of low-income immigrants, and we do it through law and policy. So there's a bunch of lawyers and policy experts at NIIC that dedicate their time and their energy and their effort to really focusing on these two things. But I think what distinguishes us from other legal advocacy organizations is our commitment to movement. So we see ourselves as movement lawyers. We never go out it alone. We are of service to the movement. And we believe that we also have to focus a lot of time and energy to engaging in narrative change, because it's gotten lost, and we have to go back to the basic principles of changing hearts and minds. I do want for all of us, just with the remaining time that I have left, to do a little bit of a pivot and to situate ourselves in the moment that we're in, because I think a year from now we will be feeling very differently, and we will likely have low energies and we'll really feel the weight of the moment. And I want to remind us, and I have this really quickly, I've got 2 minutes, and in my 2 minutes I'm going to get through this. I have my notes here because I want to be really specific, and I want you all to hold on to this and remember this, that the abolitionist movement in the United States lasted from the mid-18th century until 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified and slavery was outlawed. The women's suffrage movement in the US lasted for nearly 100 years, beginning in the mid-19th century and ending with ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The civil rights movement had its roots in the Reconstruction era of the late 19th century, its modern roots in the 1940s, and that paved the way for the civil rights movement that we know of, that combined direct action, nonviolence resistance, and civil disobedience over a time period between 1954 and 1968, right? And we know that the civil rights movement is still very much alive and well. So we have to recognize that the battles that we wage are gonna take time, and we cannot give up. I want to, I think I still have a little bit of time, right? The next 4 years are gonna be really hard. We have to protect each other. We have to fight together. And we have to also pace ourselves and think about community care. As Sata Shakur reminded us, right? We have to love each other and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our change. So I hope today, coming out of this conference, that we pledge in this room that we will never give up, we will never surrender, and we will be warriors for justice no matter what.
I appreciated that history because I think when I think about the immigrant rights movement, I think about the American economy running on sort of exploited non-citizen labor since chattel slavery, right? We've always had a large non-citizen population that are maintained in a non-citizen status to fuel major industries. That's been, it's as American of a story as we have. It's just changed to happen to be in that status. And so the reason that I say that is I believe, and to get really practical, Forward is differently situated. It came out of tech leaders. It's bipartisan after the 2013 Senate immigration bill. It was this idea that now American business leaders were sort of on board with this idea of reforming the entire immigration system. Where are we right now? I think we really need to, one, and I say this it's going to be hard to do is that we have to wage a very strong defense of immigrant communities over the next 4 years, but we have to also wage an equally strong sort of visioning and selling an affirmative plan around immigration reform and what that looks like in today's electorate and today's politics and in our communities. I actually think something interesting happened during what I'll just sort of name like the city's crisis. And I say crisis, right, because that's how the American electorate generally perceived it, was that this old issue of the idea that we make it really hard for someone to get a work permit when they enter and cross the border, right? And all of a sudden, calls I was getting from places like New York and Denver and people interested in federal immigration policy were like, why on earth would we make it so hard for somebody to work? And that was something from the Clinton era, from '96, and all of a sudden, we had sort of this new space to be like, isn't it dumb how the system works? Like, isn't it dumb that we admit people here and then we do not allow them to support themselves? And all of a sudden that's changing, and it showed me, it actually gave me a great amount of hope about our communities, about the practicality actually of American communities, and identifying the issues. It's going to look really, really different than this idea of path to citizenship plus border security equals changed immigration system. And where I want to partner and work with all of you and to work with Forward is I really want to be generating a series of really accessible ways that communities can plug into policies that co-create a better future with American citizens and immigrants alike, and by doing so, by pointing out the absurdities in our current system. That's a different approach. We're all gonna be trying things. In a year, we'll all like look back and be like, that absolutely didn't work, or maybe it did, or maybe we had progress. But I hope that people, and I always thought when I was sitting, when I was working at the White House, when I wanted to better understand something around foreign policy or asylum seekers, my job was sort of around border management, border security. I would go to frontline border service providers, and they could tell me more about why people had just crossed the border, and they could tell me more about what those people wanted from the system, and they could tell me how to operationally do things better and safer, and actually work more efficiently with whether it was Border Patrol or other entities and mayors. And all of you know you probably have a million ideas for a better immigration system that no one sitting on Capitol Hill right now is thinking of, and we have to freshen up and not just pull. I don't want to see like 2013 bill be dusted off the shelf and sold to Americans as a solution anymore. We have better ones, and I'm sure all of you have better ones. So that's what we'll be trying to focus on at Forward, and yeah, that's sort of giving me hope and excitement.
Thank you, Andrea.
So real quick, so for APIAVote, we're a network of local Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander organizations. So we're going to really be focusing on providing the support and really focusing on the health of our organizations and their members, because they're the ones who are going to be on the front lines. So what is it that we could do to actually help making sure that resources are provided? Or like I had noted about what is our communications infrastructure and our organizing infrastructure? How can we revisit that and strengthen that? But also, I just need to remind everyone that there are elections every single year. I know it's hard to think about that since we just went through the presidential, but I'm already thinking, like, what can we do in New Jersey and Virginia? Because a lot of these local elections is where it's another tool for us to be able to utilize as we deal with all this dysfunction at the federal level.
Well said, thank you.
So we don't necessarily do a lot of the response work. We're still going to continue to build a system that provides an opportunity for our communities to not only survive, but thrive. And so that in practicality, in practice, there's a lot of nuance to that, so I won't go into too much detail. But what I will say is the one thing that we have found to be more important than ever is narrative. And I want to just tell you all a little about a meeting I recently had with a newspaper editor who was basically talking about representation of Arab Americans versus Arabs. And what he was telling me was essentially that their coverage of Arab Americans has been really great, and how he sees what Arab Americans have accomplished and this and that. And what I may find, he was telling me, problematic is the coverage of Arabs in the Arab world. And what I realized at that moment is he had this image, he was basically talking about the good Arab and the bad Arab, and somehow as if being in the United States has somehow made me better and made Arab Americans better. And what that told me is that we need to, when we talk about narrative, it's not the narrative only about our communities here, it's also all the lies about our communities in our countries. And so while people may see South Lebanon resisting Israel as a terrorist activity, I see it as a resistance to a colonialist land grab. When Palestinians are fighting 75 years of apartheid, that is them resisting apartheid, not terrorism. And so when we talk about narrative of our people here in the United States, it is very much rooted in the narrative of what is happening in our countries. And so the reason I say all of that, what does that mean for us here? For me, that means something very simple. No longer accepting the narrative as it is provided and starting to resist the language that is provided and rooting everything we say in history and in reality. So when we are talking about immigrants and why there are people at the border, let's talk about why they're at the border. Let's talk about what it is in their countries that they are having to flee, probably because of some involvement by the United States and what we have caused, because then bringing them in and creating a place for them to thrive is our responsibility, because we have created the situation in their countries that they came here for. And that changes everything. That narrative changes everything. And the last thing I will say is what that means for us moving forward, for our work specifically, but I hope for all of your organizations as well, is that you're not only responding, we will have to respond to the next 4 years because it will be terrible for our communities, but to also remember what we are trying to build and what we are trying to work towards so that some of us are continuing to keep our eye on that long-term vision for our communities to survive, but also thrive.
Thank you, Rima, for that reminder that the status quo and the political system wants not just to pit us against each other, but to pit us against our own selves, our roots, our families, our cultures, our countries of origin, and relies on us cutting ourselves off at the roots, which is no healthy thing can exist cut off at the roots. Norma Wong opened us with a reminder that we are inheritors of traditions of wisdom, of self-governance and democracy that are older than the United States of America, and it is to those that we must turn in this moment. I think for many of us, the gift that we as immigrants bring to America is where we come from. We have seen it slide into authoritarianism, and we have seen it rise out of authoritarianism. And sometimes we've had to fight that fight more than once. And so I think before the election, a talking point that I would hear often is if Trump wins and there's a trifecta in the courts and Congress, that it's game over. I heard this term a lot, game over. And we opened with one nerdy metaphor about this being a time of heroes and sheroes and theros. And we're gonna end with another, which is a reminder that it's not game over, it's game on, that we collectively need to level up for this new level. And to all of you, to the heroes, sheroes, theros in the audience and on this panel, thank you, and we'll move forward together.